Today is Thursday, August 13th, 2026, and today is International Left-Handers Day. And as a left-handed person, I feel qualified to say, we have suffered enough. Scissors were not made for us. 3-ring binders were not made for us. Spiral notebooks are basically a wrist-based punishment system. And every time I write with a pen, there is a decent chance I am going to leave looking like I just changed the oil in a very small car. But I will say this for left-handed people. We learn early that the world is not always built with us in mind. You adapt. You turn the paper sideways. You use the desk wrong. You smear the ink. You keep going anyway. And August 13th gives us a few moments where the version people remember is not always the whole story. First, we'll hear a song before it became a rock and roll legend. Then, we'll see a city divided almost overnight. And then later, we'll meet a cartoon that somehow went from construction paper chaos to a cultural institution. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who apparently spends an unhealthy amount of time wandering through historical rabbit holes so you don't have to. Most people know Hound Dog because of Elvis Presley. That version became enormous. It became one of those songs that seems almost permanently attached to the early days of rock and roll. But Elvis was not the first person to make Hound Dog famous. On August 13, 1952, Big Mama Thornton recorded her version of the song. And it was not polished in the way many people sometimes imagine old recordings. It was raw, bold, bluesy, full of attitude. Thornton did not sing it like she was asking for permission. She sang it like she had already made up her mind. That is what makes her version so powerful. Before Hound Dog became a rock and roll milestone, it was a rhythm and blues hit with a completely different energy. Big Mama Thornton's recording had bite. It had humor. It had confidence. And it came from an artist whose voice could fill a room before the band even had a chance to catch up. Strange thing is that history often remembers the second version louder than the first. Elvis turned Hound Dog into a massive pop culture moment, but Thornton's version came first. And knowing that changes how the song feels. It reminds us that famous things usually have earlier chapters. Before the version everyone knows, there is often another version. Before the legend, there is usually someone doing the work. And in this case, that someone was Big Mama Thornton. A woman with a voice big enough to leave a mark on a song that the world would keep singing long after too many people forgot where it started. And from a song whose history made more than one version, August 13th takes us to a city where two versions of the same place were suddenly forced apart. Berlin. On August 13th, 1961, East Germany began closing the border between East and West Berlin. At first, it was not the concrete wall people picture today. It began with barbed wire. Roads were blocked. Train routes were cut. Families woke up to find that the city they knew had changed while they slept. That is one of the hardest parts to imagine. A street that had been open yesterday was suddenly closed. A workplace, a school, a friend, a relative could now be on the other side of a line that did not exist in the same way the day before. The Berlin Wall would eventually become one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War. But before it became a symbol, it was a real barrier in real people's lives. It divided neighborhoods. It separated families. It turned ordinary movement into an act of politics. And over time, the wall became more than concrete and guards and checkpoints. It became a physical reminder that ideas can reshape daily life. Not in some abstract way, in a very practical way. Where you can go, who you can see, what risks you are willing to take. That is what makes August 13, 1961 so important. The wall did not begin as the fully formed image history remembers. It began with sudden restrictions, confusion, fear, and people trying to understand what had just happened to their city. And once that line was drawn, life on both sides changed. And while the Berlin Wall showed how powerful a line could become when it was drawn across a city, August 13th also gives us a very different kind of line. A line people either thought was hilarious or thought should probably not have been crossed at all. On August 13th, 1997, South Park debuted on Comedy Central. And it is almost hard now to remember how strange that looked at the time. The animation was crude. The voices were ridiculous. The characters looked like construction paper cutouts that had somehow developed terrible judgment. And the humor was not polite. It was loud, sharp, offensive, immature, sometimes surprisingly smart. And very often all of those things at the same time. But that was part of why it stood out. South Park did not look like a traditional animated show. It did not sound like one. And it definitely did not behave like one. It arrived at a moment when adult animation was still finding new territory on television. The Simpsons had already proved that cartoons were not just for children. But South Park pushed that idea in a much more chaotic direction. It was faster, ruder, more topical. And somehow underneath the absurdity, it developed a reputation for reacting to culture almost in real time. That is one of the strangest things about the show. The first impression was easy to dismiss. A bunch of foul-mouthed kids in a weird little mountain town. But over time, South Park became something larger. A comedy show, a cultural argument, a place where politics, celebrity, religion, entertainment, and whatever people were angry about that week could all get thrown into the same blender. And whether someone loved it or hated it, it became hard to ignore. Sometimes the things that last are not the things that arrive politely. Sometimes they are the things that barge in, make everyone uncomfortable, and somehow become part of the furniture. And that makes me think about someone who understood discomfort better than almost anyone in entertainment history. Before people knew his name as a brand, before the silhouette, before the television introductions, before audiences started expecting him to appear for just a second somewhere in his own movies, he was a filmmaker who understood that fear is not only about what happens, it is about what might happen. A staircase, a motel room, a flock of birds, a pair of eyes watching from across a courtyard, a shower curtain. He knew how to make ordinary things feel unsafe. And he knew that sometimes the scariest part of a scene is not the moment something happens. It is the waiting. Today we are talking about Alfred Hitchcock, born August 13th, 1899. Hitchcock became known as the master of suspense, and that title fits because suspense was really his language. He did not make movies where frightening things occurred. He made audiences participate. He gave viewers information. He withheld information. He let people know just enough to become nervous, and then he made them sit with it. That is why so many of his films still feel familiar, even to people who have never sat down and watched them all the way through. Psycho, Rear Window, North by Northwest, The Birds. Those titles became part of the culture. So did the image of Hitchcock himself. The round face, the dry voice, the dark humor, the little cameos. He became one of those rare directors whose personality became almost as recognizable as the movies he made. And that is not easy to do. Most directors stay behind the camera. Hitchcock somehow became part of the show. He turned suspense into entertainment. He turned anxiety into craft. And he proved that sometimes the thing an audience does not see can be more powerful than the thing right in front of them. That feels like a strange but fitting place for August 13th to land. A song remembered differently than it began. A wall that turned a city into a symbol. A cartoon that crossed lines and somehow stayed on television for decades. And a filmmaker who knew exactly how much could happen in the space before something happens. Anyway, the next time I struggle with left-handed scissors, I'll try to remember that discomfort can apparently lead to great art. Although in my case, it mostly leads to uneven paper and mild resentment. and that reminds me of something Alfred Hitchcock once said. Drama is life with the dull bits cut out. If you'd like to hear more of my work or see other corners of the internet I've been quietly building things in, you can head over to waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. Thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'll see you tomorrow.